A man worth $3 billion sits alone in his penthouse, watching security footage of his new housekeeper discovering an open safe containing more money than most people see in a lifetime. But here's the thing that will send chills down your spine. He forgets to lock that safe. He left it open on purpose. It was a trap, a final test that would either confirm his darkest beliefs about human nature or shatter everything he thought he knew about trust. What happened next changed both their lives forever. Let me tell you about Julius Blackwood, though. That's not his real name. The media called him a recluse, a paranoid billionaire who hadn't been photographed in public for over a decade. But the truth was far more heartbreaking than any tabloid could capture. Julius lived in a fortress of glass and steel, 40 floors above the bustling city of Chicago. Every window was bulletproof. Every door required 3 different security codes. Every person who entered his world was vetted, monitored, and kept at arm's length. You see, when you have $3 billion, you quickly learn that everyone wants something from you. And Julius learned this lesson in the most painful way possible. It started with his brother Marcus. Growing up, they were inseparable. Julius was the older one, the dreamer who saw potential in every abandoned building and empty lot. Marcus was the charmer, the one who could sell ice to an Eskimo and make them thank him for it. When Julius's first real estate venture took off, a rundown apartment complex he'd transformed into luxury condos, Marcus was right there beside him, celebrating like it was his own victory. "We did it, Jules," Marcus had shouted that night, champagne flowing freely in their cramped studio apartment. "We're gonna be rich." But as Julius's empire grew, so did the distance between them. Marcus started showing up to family dinners with expensive watches and designer suits, claiming he'd made smart investments. He'd borrow money for sure-thing deals that somehow never materialized. And when Julius finally discovered that Marcus had been forging his signature on bank documents, stealing nearly $2 million over 3 years, it wasn't the money that broke him. It was the realization that his best friend, his blood, had been lying to his face every single day. The confrontation was ugly. Marcus didn't even apologize. Instead, he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that Julius still heard in his quietest moments. "You think you're better than me?" Marcus had sneered. "You think your money makes you some kind of saint? Everyone's going to use you, Julius. Everyone. At least I'm family." That was 12 years ago. Marcus walked out that night and never came back. But Marcus was just the beginning. There was Sarah, the woman Julius thought he'd marry. They'd met at a charity gala. She was running a nonprofit for homeless veterans, and her passion for helping others made Julius's chest tight with something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Love. Real, honest love. For 8 months, Sarah was his world. She'd come to his penthouse with stories about the people she'd helped, photos of families who'd found housing, veterans who'd found purpose. Julius donated quietly at first, then more openly, eventually becoming the nonprofit's largest supporter. He was planning to propose when he discovered the truth. Sarah's charity was a front. The money, his money, was being funneled into offshore accounts. The homeless veterans she spoke about so passionately, they were actors hired for elaborate photo shoots. When Julius confronted her, Sarah didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She simply shrugged and said, "You have more money than God, Julius. Did you really think a few million would make a difference to you?" The betrayal cut deeper than anything Marcus had done, because Sarah hadn't just stolen his money, she'd stolen his hope. After Sarah, Julius retreated. He hired security firms to vet everyone in his life. He discovered that his accountant had been skimming funds for years. His personal trainer was selling stories about his workouts to gossip magazines. Even his barber, a 70-year-old Italian man Julius had trusted for 5 years, was recording their conversations and selling them to tabloids hungry for any scraps about the mysterious billionaire. One by one, Julius cut them all out. The penthouse became his sanctuary and his prison. He conducted all his business through video calls and encrypted emails. Food was delivered by services that left everything at a secure drop-off point. He hadn't shaken hands with another human being in over 3 years. But here's the thing about isolation. It's like a slow poison. It seeps into your bones until you forget what it feels like to trust, to hope, to believe that somewhere in the world there might be one person who sees you as more than a bank account with legs. Julius told himself he was fine. He had his books, his music, his view of the city sprawling endlessly below. He didn't need people. People were variables, unpredictable factors that could only bring chaos and pain. Better to be alone and safe than surrounded and betrayed. But even billionaires need someone to clean the toilets. That's how Grace Mendoza entered his life. Not as a friend or a lover or a business partner, but as an employee of Elite Domestic Services, the most exclusive housekeeping company in Chicago. They specialized in high net worth clients who valued discretion above all else. Julius had gone through 7 different housekeepers in 2 years. Most quit after a few weeks, claiming the security protocols were too invasive. One had tried to steal a rare first edition book. Another had attempted to plant listening devices in his bedroom. Even his barber, a 70-year-old Italian man Julius had trusted for 5 years, was recording their conversations and selling them to tabloids hungry for any scraps about the mysterious billionaire. One by one, Julius cut them all out. The penthouse became his sanctuary and his prison. He conducted all his business through video calls and encrypted emails. Food was delivered by services that left everything at a secure drop-off point. He hadn't shaken hands with another human being in over 3 years. But here's the thing about isolation. It's like a slow poison. It seeps into your bones until you forget what it feels like to trust, to hope, to believe that somewhere in the world there might be one person who sees you as more than a bank account with legs. Julius told himself he was fine. He had his books, his music, his view of the city sprawling endlessly below. He didn't need people. People were variables, unpredictable factors that could only bring chaos and pain. Better to be alone and safe than surrounded and betrayed. But even billionaires need someone to clean the toilets. That's how Grace Mendoza entered his life. Not as a friend or a lover or a business partner, but as an employee of Elite Domestic Services, the most exclusive housekeeping company in Chicago. They specialized in high net worth clients who valued discretion above all else. Julius had gone through 7 different housekeepers in 2 years. Most quit after a few weeks, claiming the security protocols were too invasive. One had tried to steal a rare first edition book. Another had attempted to plant listening devices in his bedroom. Grace was different from the start, though Julius couldn't quite put his finger on why.
She was 42 years old, with graying hair she kept pulled back in a simple bun and hands that looked like they'd known honest work. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, except for a simple gold cross around her neck. When the agency introduced her, she looked Julius directly in the eyes, not with the calculating gaze he'd grown accustomed to, but with something that seemed almost like understanding. "Mr. Blackwood," she'd said in accented English, her voice warm but professional, "I understand you value your privacy. I respect that. I have 3 rules. I do my work well, I mind my own business, and I never take what isn't mine. Is that acceptable to you?" Julius had hired her on the spot, though he couldn't have explained why. For the first month, Grace was like a ghost in his penthouse. She arrived every Tuesday and Friday at exactly 8 in the morning, cleaned with meticulous precision, and left by 2 in the afternoon without saying more than "Good morning" and "Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwood." She never asked personal questions, never lingered in rooms where Julius was working, never so much as touched his personal belongings without permission. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, her presence began to change the atmosphere of the penthouse. Julius would find little touches that hadn't been there before. Fresh flowers in the kitchen, arranged with simple elegance. His books, previously scattered across various surfaces, were now organized, but in a way that suggested she'd actually paid attention to what he was reading. The morning light seemed to fall differently through windows that had been cleaned with a care that went beyond mere professionalism. And then there were the notes. The first one appeared on a Tuesday morning in early October. Julius had been battling a particularly vicious case of food poisoning, something from a high-end delivery service that had left him bedridden for 3 days. When he finally dragged himself to the kitchen, he found a thermos of homemade chicken soup sitting on the counter with a simple note, "For your health, G." Julius stared at that note for 15 minutes. When was the last time someone had done something for him without wanting anything in return? When was the last time someone had noticed he was sick and cared enough to do something about it? He drank the soup. It was the best he'd tasted since his grandmother's, back when he was 8 years old and the world still felt safe. More notes followed. "The roses on the terrace need water. Your coffee maker is making strange noises, might need servicing. Happy birthday, Mr. Blackwood." That last one had nearly brought him to tears. He'd forgotten he'd mentioned his birthday in passing 6 months earlier. Grace had remembered. Gradually, their interactions grew longer. Grace would ask about his day, not with the intrusive curiosity he'd grown to hate, but with genuine interest. She told him small things about her own life, how she was saving money to bring her sister's family to America from El Salvador, how she volunteered at her church's food bank on weekends, how she'd learned English by watching old movies at the public library. "My favorite is It's a Wonderful Life," she'd said one Friday afternoon as she arranged fresh tulips in the living room. "I must have watched it 50 times. Every time I cry when George Bailey realizes how many lives he has touched." Julius had watched that movie himself years ago, back when he still believed in the possibility of wonderful lives and meaningful connections. Now it just seemed like a fairy tale. But as the weeks turned into months, Julius found himself looking forward to Grace's visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified him. She was like a window into a world he'd forgotten existed, a world where people kept their word, where kindness wasn't a calculated strategy, where trust was possible. And that terrified him more than any business deal or financial crisis ever had. Because Julius had learned, through years of painful experience, that everyone eventually showed their true colors. The question wasn't if Grace would disappoint him, but when and how. So he began to test her, in small ways at first. He'd leave $20 bills on his desk and count them later. He'd mention valuable items casually,
watching for any flicker of interest in her eyes. He'd create scenarios where she could easily take something without being caught. Grace passed every test without even seeming she was being tested. The $20 bills were always exactly where he'd left them. When he mentioned his collection of rare watches, she simply nodded and continued dusting. When he accidentally left his laptop open to his bank account information, she closed it respectfully and moved it to a safer spot. But Julius couldn't let himself believe, not yet, because he'd been fooled before, and the pain of betrayal had nearly destroyed him. If Grace was going to reveal her true nature, he needed to know sooner rather than later, before he made the mistake of actually trusting her. So he devised the ultimate test. The safe in his home office was a massive thing, installed by the penthouse's previous owner. Julius barely used it. Most of his important documents were stored digitally, and he kept very little cash on hand. But for this test, he filled it with more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Neat stacks of $100 bills arranged in precise rows. $50,000 in cash, sitting there like a dragon's hoard, waiting to be discovered. On the morning of the test, Julius made sure to be called away on urgent business. He'd never left Grace alone in the penthouse before. It went against every security protocol he'd established. But this had to look natural, unplanned. "I'm sorry, Grace," he'd said, grabbing his coat with what he hoped looked like genuine urgency. "There's an emergency with one of my properties. I need to leave immediately. Would you mind letting yourself out when you're finished? Just engage the main lock on your way out." Grace had nodded, her expression showing only mild concern. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. I hope everything is all right." "I'm sure it will be," Julius had replied, though his heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. He left the penthouse and took the elevator down exactly 3 floors, then used his master key to access an empty unit that gave him a perfect view of his home office through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd positioned cameras throughout the penthouse months ago, a security measure that had caught previous housekeepers in various acts of theft and betrayal. Now those cameras would show him who Grace really was. Julius settled in to wait, his laptop displaying multiple camera feeds from his penthouse. He watched Grace work, moving through her routine with the same careful precision she always showed. She cleaned the kitchen first, then the living areas, working her way toward his office with methodical efficiency. When she reached his office, Julius held his breath. The safe was clearly visible from the doorway, a massive steel door hanging wide open, revealing stacks of cash that seemed to glow under the office lights. Julius had made sure of that, adjusting the lighting the night before to ensure the money would be impossible to miss. Grace entered the office and began dusting, her movements natural and unhurried. She cleaned his desk, organized his papers with the same respectful care she always showed, watered the small plant by the window. And then she saw the safe. Julius leaned forward, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. This was it. This was the moment when Grace would reveal her true nature, when she would prove that she was just like everyone else in his life, that trust was an illusion and hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. Grace froze when she spotted the open safe, her cloth-covered hand stopping mid-motion on the windowsill. For a long moment, she simply stared at the stacks of money, her expression unreadable. Then she did something Julius had never expected. She walked away. Not toward the safe, not closer to the money, but away from it entirely. She finished cleaning the rest of the office, carefully avoiding even looking in the direction of the safe again. When she was done, she gathered her cleaning supplies and headed for the door. But then she stopped.
Julius watched, his heart hammering, as Grace set down her supplies and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number and waited, her back straight, her expression serious. "Mr. Blackwood?" Her voice came clearly through the phone Julius had forgotten he was holding. "I hope I'm not interrupting your emergency, but I wanted to let you know your office safe is open. I don't know if you forgot to close it or if there's a problem with the lock, but there's money visible inside. I didn't want to touch it or go near it, but I thought you should know right away." Julius stared at his phone, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. Grace had called him. She had seen $50,000 in cash, more money than she probably made in 2 years, and her first instinct had been to protect it, to protect him. Julius started, then stopped, his voice catching in his throat. "Thank you, Grace. I'll take care of it when I get back." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. I'll finish up and lock the main door as usual. I hope your emergency resolves quickly." The line went dead, and Julius sat in the empty apartment, staring at his phone as tears he hadn't shed in years began to blur his vision. On the laptop screen, he watched Grace finish her work with the same quiet dignity she always showed. She gathered her supplies, took one last look around to make sure everything was perfect, and headed for the door. As she passed the office, she carefully pulled the door closed, not all the way, but enough to hide the safe from view while still allowing air to circulate. Even in that small gesture, Julius could see her thoughtfulness, her respect for his property and his privacy. Grace locked the main door behind her and disappeared into the elevator, leaving Julius alone with the weight of what had just happened. For 3 hours, Julius sat in that empty apartment, staring at the camera feeds of his silent penthouse. Grace had passed his test, but in doing so, she had failed him in a way that was almost worse than if she had stolen the money. She had proven him wrong. For 12 years, Julius had built his life around the certainty that people were fundamentally selfish, that everyone had a price, that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. It was a cold philosophy, but it was safe. It protected him from the kind of pain Marcus and Sarah had inflicted. But Grace had shattered that certainty with a single phone call. When Julius finally returned to his penthouse that evening, he found it exactly as Grace had left it, spotless, organized, with fresh flowers on the kitchen counter and a faint scent of lemon cleaner in the air. The office door was still partially closed, the safe still gaping open like a mouth full of accusations. Julius closed the safe and spun the lock, his hands shaking slightly. Then he sat at his desk and tried to understand what he was feeling. Relief, gratitude, fear, all of those, but something else too. Something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten what to call it. Hope. The next Tuesday, Grace arrived at her usual time, but Julius was waiting for her in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and an envelope containing her regular payment plus a substantial bonus. "Good morning, Grace," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I wanted to thank you for calling me about the safe last week."
Grace accepted the coffee, but pushed the envelope back toward him. "The bonus isn't necessary, Mr. Blackwood. I was just doing what anyone would do." "No," Julius said quietly. "You weren't doing what anyone would do. You were doing what you would do. There's a difference." Grace studied his face for a long moment, and Julius had the unsettling feeling that she could see right through him, past the walls he'd built, past the fear and suspicion, to the lonely man underneath. "Mr. Blackwood," she said finally, "may I ask you something personal?" Julius tensed, every instinct screaming at him to shut down the conversation, to retreat behind professional boundaries. But something in Grace's tone, gentle, respectful, genuinely caring, made him nod. "You don't trust people very much, do you?" The question hit Julius like a physical blow. He wanted to deny it, to deflect with humor or anger or cold professionalism. Instead, he found himself answering with an honesty that surprised them both. "No," he said simply, "I don't." Grace nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. "I understand. People have hurt you." It wasn't a question, and Julius didn't treat it like one. "Yes." "I'm sorry," Grace said, and the simple sincerity in her voice made Julius's chest tight. It's a terrible thing to lose faith in people. It's like losing faith in yourself. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning light streaming through the windows and casting everything in soft gold. Finally, Grace spoke again. "Can I tell you why I do this job, Mr. Blackwood?" Julius nodded, not trusting his voice. 3 years ago, my sister Maria was in a very bad situation in El Salvador. Her husband had left her with 3 children and no money, and the neighborhood where they lived, it wasn't safe. I had been working as a housekeeper for a wealthy family here, saving every penny I could, but it wasn't enough to bring them to America. Not legally, anyway. Grace paused, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup like it was an anchor. I was desperate. I was considering other options, dangerous options. And then something happened that changed everything. Julius leaned forward despite himself, drawn into the story. The family I worked for, they had a son who was very sick, cancer. I watched that little boy fight for his life for months, and I watched his parents pour everything they had into trying to save him. Money, time, hope, faith, everything. Grace's voice grew softer but stronger somehow. One day, the father found me crying in the kitchen. I thought I was going to be fired for unprofessional behavior, but instead, he sat down and asked me what was wrong. I told him about Maria, about the children, about how hopeless everything felt. And do you know what he did? Julius shook his head, though he thought he might know where this was going. He wrote me a check, right there, on the spot. Enough money to bring Maria and her children to America safely and legally. I tried to refuse. I told him I couldn't possibly accept such a gift, but he said something I'll never forget. Grace looked directly at Julius, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He said, "Grace, you've been taking care of my family during the worst time of our lives. You've cleaned up after our tears, brought us soup when we were too heartbroken to eat, and never once asked for anything in return. The least I can do is help you take care of your family too." Julius felt his own eyes growing wet, though he couldn't have said why. "That man taught me something important," Grace continued. "He taught me that kindness isn't about what you can get, it's about what you can give. And he taught me that when someone shows you trust, really shows you trust, the only appropriate response is to be worthy of it." Grace reached into her purse and pulled out a small worn photograph. She handed it to Julius, and he found himself looking at 4 faces: a woman who looked like a younger version of Grace, and 3 children with bright smiles and hopeful eyes. "Maria and her children," Grace said. "They've been here for 2 years now. Maria works as a nurse's aide, and the kids are in school. They're safe, and they're happy, and they have a future. All because one man decided to trust me, and I decided to be worthy of that trust." Julius stared at the photograph, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't name. "The father who helped you," he said quietly. "What was his name?" Grace smiled, a sad, beautiful expression that seemed to light up the entire kitchen. His name was Julius Blackwood. The photograph slipped from Julius's fingers and fluttered to the floor.
He stared at Grace, his mind reeling, trying to process what she just said. That's impossible, he whispered. I never. But even as he said it, the memory was coming back. 3 years ago, a brief interaction with one of his housekeepers, not the regular service he used now, but a different company. A woman who'd been crying in his kitchen while he grabbed a bottle of water between business calls. He'd barely paid attention at the time, his mind focused on a merger that was falling apart. But he remembered now. Her story about her sister, the desperation in her voice, the way she'd tried to refuse his help. He'd written the check without thinking much about it. $25,000. It was pocket change to him, but to her. "You're G. Mendoza," he said slowly, "from Elite Domestic Services. You specifically requested to work for me." Grace nodded. "When I saw your name on the client list, I knew I had to find a way to work for you again. Not for the money. You'd already given me more than I could ever repay, but because I wanted to do something for you in return. I wanted to take care of you the way you took care of my family." Julius felt something breaking open in his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart crumbling like ancient mortar. "But why didn't you say anything?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Grace's smile was gentle, understanding. "Because you needed to trust me for who I am now, not for what you did for me 3 years ago. You needed to believe that kindness exists without expecting anything in return." Julius stared at her, this woman who had quietly, patiently, lovingly proven to him that not everyone in the world was out to betray him. She had taken care of him, protected him, respected him, not because of what he could give her, but because of what he had already given her, and more than that, because of who she chose to be. "The safe," he said suddenly. "It was a test. I was testing you." Grace nodded calmly. "I know." "You knew?" "Mr. Blackwood, in 3 years of working for you, you have never once left that safe open. You have never once forgotten to lock anything. You are the most careful, methodical person I know. Of course it was a test." Julius felt heat rise in his cheeks. "And you're not angry?" Grace considered this for a moment. "A little sad, maybe, but not angry. You needed to know if you could trust me, and now you do." "Yes," Julius said quietly. "Now I do." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 12 years of isolation and fear lifting slowly from Julius's shoulders. Finally, Grace stood and began gathering her cleaning supplies. "Grace, wait," Julius said. "I need to ask you something." She turned back to him, patient as always. "The money I gave you 3 years ago," he said. "It wasn't charity. It wasn't some grand gesture. I barely thought about it. Why did it mean so much to you?" Grace smiled, and Julius realized it was the first time he'd seen her truly, completely happy. "Because you saw me," she said simply. "In that moment, when I was just another employee having a breakdown in your kitchen, you saw me as a person with real problems and real feelings. You didn't have to care about my sister or my struggles, but you did. And that caring, that recognition that I mattered as a human being, that was worth more than any amount of money." Julius felt tears running down his face, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to hide them. "Grace," he said, his voice breaking slightly, would you like to stay for lunch today? I could order something, or if you know how to cook." Grace's face lit up with joy. "Mr. Blackwood, I would love to cook for you. What would you like?" "Surprise me," Julius said, and realized that for the first time in over a decade, he actually meant it. That afternoon, Grace cooked a simple meal of rice and beans, seasoned with spices she'd brought from home. They ate together at Julius's kitchen table, talking about everything and nothing: Grace's life in El Salvador, Julius's childhood dreams of becoming an architect, the books they'd both read, the movies that made them cry. As the sun began to set over the city, painting the penthouse in shades of gold and orange, Julius realized something profound had changed. The fortress he'd built around himself hadn't been torn down, it had been transformed. The walls were still there, but now they had doors and windows, and for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to open them. "Grace," he said as she prepared to leave, "I need to tell you something." She waited, her expression open and patient. "I've been alone for a very long time," Julia said carefully, "and I've convinced myself that it was safer that way. But you've shown me something I'd forgotten, that safety without connection isn't really living at all. It's just existing." Grace nodded, understanding without judgment. "I don't know how to be around people anymore," Julius continued. "I don't know how to trust, or how to be a friend, or how to let people see me as I really am. But I'd like to learn, if you're willing to be patient with me." Grace reached across the table and gently touched Julius's hand, the first time anyone had touched him in over 3 years. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, "family isn't built by blood, it's built by trust, and I would be honored to be part of your family." Julius squeezed her hand, feeling something he hadn't felt since he was a child, the warm, golden certainty of being truly known and accepted by another human being. "Julius," he said, "please, just call me Julius." Grace smiled, and Julius saw his future spreading out before him like a map of possibilities he'd thought were lost forever. It wouldn't be easy, learning to trust again, learning to open his heart to the risk of being hurt, but for the first time in 12 years, he believed it was possible. And it all started with a woman who saw $50,000 in cash and chose to make a phone call instead of making a withdrawal. 6 months later, Julius's penthouse looked completely different. Oh, the security was still there. Some caution is just common sense when you're worth $3 billion. But the atmosphere had changed entirely. Grace still came twice a week, but now she brought her sister Maria and the children sometimes. Julius had converted one of his guest rooms into a playroom, complete with books and games and art supplies. The sound of children's laughter echoing through the halls was something Julius had never imagined he'd hear in his home, and it filled him with a joy he couldn't have described.
He'd also started venturing out into the world again. Not for business meetings conducted in sterile conference rooms, but for real experiences. He and Grace went to the farmers market together on Saturday mornings. He'd started volunteering at her church's food bank, discovering that serving soup to homeless families was more fulfilling than any business deal he'd ever closed. Most surprisingly, Julius had started dating again. Not seriously, he wasn't ready for that yet. But he'd accepted a few invitations to dinner, attended some charity events, even gone to a movie with a woman he'd met at the food bank. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely different from the calculated relationships he'd had before. The difference, he told Grace one afternoon as they prepared care packages for homeless families, is that I'm not looking for someone to complete me anymore. I'm looking for someone to share who I already am. Grace had smiled at that, the proud smile of someone watching a friend discover their own strength. But perhaps the most significant change was the one that happened on a cold Tuesday morning in March. Julius was in his office reviewing contracts when his phone rang.
The caller ID showed a number he hadn't seen in 12 years. Marcus! Julius stared at the phone for a long moment, his first instinct to let it go to voicemail. But something, maybe it was Grace's influence, maybe it was his own growing capacity for hope, made him answer. "Hello, Marcus." Julius. His brother's voice was older, rougher, but unmistakably familiar. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "I wasn't sure I would either." There was a long pause, filled with 12 years of silence and hurt. "I heard you've been getting out more," Marcus said finally. "Volunteering, dating, people are talking." "People always talk." "Yeah, but this is different. They're saying you seem happy." Julius considered this. Was he happy? It was hard to say. He was definitely different, more open, more willing to take risks with his heart. Whether that constituted happiness was a question for philosophers. "I'm trying to be," he said honestly. Another pause. "Julius, Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "I need to tell you something about the money I took." "Marcus, that was a long time ago." "No, let me say this, please." Marcus took a shaky breath. "I didn't take it because I needed it. I took it because I was jealous. Because you were successful and I wasn't, and I wanted to hurt you. I wanted to hurt you, that you weren't as smart as you thought you were." Julius felt the old anger stirring, but it was dulled somehow, less sharp than it had been for so many years. "I know," he said quietly. "You know?" "I've known for years, Marcus. The money was never really about the money." "Then why?" Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "Why haven't you spoken to me in 12 years?" Julius looked out his window at the city below, thinking about Grace, about trust, about the choice to build walls or doors. "Because I was hurt," he said simply, "and because I was scared that if I let you back in, you'd hurt me again." "And now?" Julius smiled, thinking about a woman who'd seen $50,000 and chosen to make a phone call. "Now, I think maybe the risk is worth it." They talked for 2 hours that day, really talked, for the first time since they were children. Marcus was different too, worn down by years of failed schemes and broken relationships, ready to be honest about his mistakes and his regrets. It would take time to rebuild what they'd lost, Julius knew. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal overnight. But it can heal. Grace had taught him that. 3 months later, Marcus came to dinner at the penthouse. Grace cooked. She'd insisted, claiming that the first family dinner in 12 years deserved something special. Julius was nervous, more nervous than he'd been about any business deal or investment. But as he watched Marcus playing with Maria's children, teaching them card tricks and making them laugh, Julius felt something shift in his chest. The past would always be there, but it didn't have to define the future. "He's different," Grace said quietly, joining Julius by the window where he'd been watching the scene unfold. "We both are," Julius replied. "Yes, you are." Grace squeezed his arm gently. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think the man who helped my family 3 years ago was always there inside you. He was just scared to come out." Julius nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Fear had been his prison, but it had also been his protection. Learning to live without it was the hardest and most rewarding thing he'd ever done. That night, after everyone had gone home and the penthouse was quiet again, Julius sat in his office and opened the safe. The same safe where he'd once stored $50,000 as bait for a trap. Now it held something far more valuable. Photographs of his chosen family, letters from Maria's children, thank you cards from the food bank, and a simple note that Grace had written him after their first real conversation. "Dear Julius,
Thank you for trusting me with your story. Thank you for letting me be part of your life. Thank you for showing me that kindness is never wasted, even when it takes years to come full circle. G. Julius smiled and closed the safe, spinning the lock automatically. But as he headed to bed, he realized something had changed even in that simple action. He was no longer locking away his treasures to protect them from the world. He was keeping them safe so he could share them with the people who mattered most. The difference, he thought, was everything. As Julius settled into sleep that night, surrounded by the quiet peace of a home filled with love instead of fear, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. It had started with betrayal and ended with redemption. It had begun with a test designed to confirm his worst suspicions about humanity and ended with proof of humanity's capacity for grace. But most importantly, it had shown him that the choice between cynicism and hope, between walls and doors, between isolation and connection, was ultimately his to make. And every day, he could make it again. Grace had given him back his faith in people, but more than that, she'd given him back his faith in himself.